They fired me for being too old, and 3 days later the hospital that fired me could not open its own doors. That is not an exaggeration, and it is not the kind of thing I would say if I could not prove every word of it, but I am getting ahead of myself, because the morning it happened, I did not know any of what was coming. All I knew was that Sterling Vance, 35 years old, 11 months into his job as CEO of Magnolia Regional Medical Center, had asked me to come to his office at 8:15 on a Tuesday, and that request alone was enough to tell me something was wrong, because Sterling Vance never asked to see anyone before 9. He liked his mornings quiet. He liked his coffee brought to him. He liked the illusion that Magnolia Regional ran itself, humming along like a well-oiled machine, and he liked to believe that illusion was his doing. It wasn't. It was mine, but I'll get to that. I sat down across from his glass desk, the one he'd special ordered when he took over, replacing the scratched oak one that had been there since before I started, the one that had seen 3 CEOs, and 2 accreditation reviews and 1 flood in the basement archive room. Sterling didn't like old things. He'd told me that once. At a leadership retreat, not about furniture, about people, though he dressed it up as being about institutional agility. I remember exactly how he said it. I remember everything people say to me when they think I'm not really listening. That has always been my gift and my curse. Beverly, he said, folding his hands on the glass like he'd rehearsed it, I want to start by saying how much this organization values everything you've contributed over the years. 15 years. That's what everything meant. 15 years of building the scheduling matrix that kept this hospital from bleeding out nurses every winter flu season. 15 years of writing the patient acuity protocol that every unit in this building still used. The one that told a charge nurse in under 90 seconds whether she had the staff to handle what just came through the ambulance bay doors. 15 years of being the person who got called at 2 in the morning when the system glitched. When a new hire panicked, when the state inspector showed up unannounced and somebody needed to walk him through documentation that made sense. But, Sterling continued, and there it was, the word I'd been waiting for since he sat down. The board and I feel that Magnolia needs to move in a more forward-facing direction. We're bringing in new scheduling software, new workflow consultants. We think it's time for some new energy in nursing administration. New energy. I was 52 years old. I want you to sit with that phrase the way I had to sit with it. Across a glass desk, in a blazer I'd pressed myself at 5 that morning before my shift, because I still believed, right up until that sentence, that today was a day like any other. I understand, I said. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask him to explain what exactly was wrong with the energy I'd been bringing for a decade and a half. I have learned, over 52 years of living in this body, in this skin, in rooms like that one, that the moment a man like Sterling Vance sees you react, he stops hearing anything else you say. So I kept my hands folded in my lap, the way my mother taught me to sit in church, and I let him finish. He slid a folder across the desk. Severance package. $42,000, structured over 6 months, contingent on a signed non-disparagement agreement. Below that, a single sheet outlining my transition timeline. I had until the end of the day to clear my office. Security would escort me to my car. Security. 15 years, and they thought they needed security. Before we continue, let me ask you something, because I think about this a lot and I'd love to know what you think. Have you ever had someone decide, in a single meeting, that everything you built didn't count for anything anymore? Let me know in the comments where you're listening from today, and whether you've ever sat across a desk like that one. I'll come back to it. I signed the papers. My hands did not shake. I want to be clear about that, because there is a version of this story where I could tell you my hands shook, where I could tell you I cried in the elevator, and maybe that version would be easier for you to picture, easier to feel sorry for. But that is not what happened. What happened is that I signed my name in the same handwriting I've used since nursing school, calm and even, and I stood up, and I said, "Thank you for the conversation, Sterling." And I watched something flicker across his face that might have been confusion, because he had expected something else from me, tears, maybe, begging. A scene he could describe later, at a board meeting to justify what he'd done. I gave him none of it. I walked back to my office, though I suppose by 3 o'clock that afternoon it would belong to whoever they hired to replace me, and a security guard named Desmond, a young man I'd trained during his first week 8 years ago, when he still worked hospital transport before moving to the security office, walked 2 steps behind me the whole way, not because he wanted to, I could tell, but because someone had told him to. He wouldn't meet my eyes in the elevator. I didn't make him. Word travels fast in a hospital. By the time I reached the 3rd floor, 2 of the unit secretaries were already whispering by the med room, the way people whisper when they think the subject of their conversation can't hear them, though of course I could point one of them. A woman named Patrice, who I had personally trained on the new charting software 18 months ago, said, just loud enough, guess 15 years doesn't mean what it used to. The other one laughed, not unkindly, exactly, the kind of laugh people give when they are relieved it isn't them. I packed my office in 55 minutes. I did not take everything. I left the framed commendation from the State Board of Nursing, the one for the sepsis response protocol that had cut our mortality numbers by 11% over 3 years. I left that hanging exactly where it was, because I did not need it to remember what I had done, and because some small, quiet part of me wanted Sterling's new hire, whoever she would be, to walk into that office and wonder who Beverly Whitfield was and why. Her name was still on the wall. What I did take was a single external hard drive, the one I'd used for years to back up my own working files, the drafts and revision histories of every protocol I'd built from scratch, the acuity matrix, the float pool algorithm, the search staffing model I'd designed during the worst of the pandemic years, back when the hospital didn't have the money to hire the consultant Sterling was so excited about now. I had built those systems on my own laptop, at my own kitchen table, on nights and weekends, because nobody had asked me to build them. The hospital's old IT department barely had the bandwidth to keep the email servers running, let alone develop clinical software. I had done it because patients were dying from bad staffing ratios, and because I could not sleep at night knowing there was a better way and nobody willing to build it. Nobody had ever formally signed those systems over to the hospital. There had never been a reason to. I was there. I maintained them. Nobody else understood them well enough to touch the code, and IT had long since stopped trying. I drove home that afternoon in silence. No radio, just the sound of my own breathing, and, somewhere underneath it, something I didn't expect to feel, relief, not happiness, not yet, but relief, the way you feel when you've been carrying something heavy for so long you forgot your shoulders could sit any other way. That evening, I did 3 things. I changed my phone number. I called my attorney, a woman named Camille Duros, who had handled my late husband's estate 7 years earlier, and who I trusted the way you trust very few people in this life. And I sent a short email to the hospital's IT department, CCing Sterling Vance directly, informing them that as of 5 o'clock that day, I would no longer be maintaining the nursing acuity and staffing systems developed under my personal ownership, and that any continued use of those systems without a licensing agreement would need to be addressed through counsel. I did not expect a response that night. I got one anyway. Sterling replied within 20 minutes, Beverly, let's not be dramatic about this. IT has everything they need. He was wrong. IT did not have everything they needed. IT had never had everything they needed. IT had me, for 15 years, quietly patching, quietly updating, quietly making sure that whatever cracks formed in the middle of the night got fixed before the morning shift walked in and had to deal with the consequences. I turned my phone off at 9 that night and slept better than I had in years. I did not know, lying in that bed, that by Thursday morning, 3 units at Magnolia Regional would be operating on paper schedules for the first time in a decade. I did not know that the surge staffing protocol, the one that told the hospital exactly how many nurses to call in when the ER hit capacity, would simply stop generating numbers, because the system depended on a set of credentials that expired automatically the moment my employee access was terminated, credentials that only I had the authority to renew, on a server I had built and maintained from a personal license I had never transferred. I did not know that in a building full of bright, capable, hard-working people, not one of them understood how the foundation under their feet actually worked. I only knew that I had signed my name in even, steady handwriting, taken what was mine, and driven home in the last of the daylight. 3 days later, my phone started ringing from numbers I didn't recognize. I let every single one of them go to voicemail. By Thursday morning, Magnolia Regional Medical Center did not know how to schedule its own nurses. I found this out the way I found out most things that week, not because anyone told me directly, but because I still had friends inside that building, women I'd worked beside for over a decade, women who did not care one bit about the non-disparagement clause I'd signed, because they hadn't signed it. Yvette Marchand called me from the parking garage on her lunch break. Her voice pitched low, like she was afraid the concrete itself might report back to administration. "Bev," she said, "you need to hear this from somebody who loves you, not from the rumor mill. It's bad in there." I was standing at my kitchen counter, hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone lukewarm, and I did not feel the satisfaction you might expect me to feel. I want to be honest about that, because there's a version of this story where I laugh, where I feel vindicated, where I pour myself something stronger than tea and toast to Sterling Vance's incompetence. That is not who I am, and it never has been. What I felt, listening to Yvette, was something closer to grief, the particular grief of watching a house you built with your own hands catch fire while the people inside argue about whose job it was to check the smoke detectors. She told me the acuity system had gone dark Wednesday at midnight, not crashed. Exactly, Yvette wasn't a technical person, and she didn't have the vocabulary for what had actually happened, but I knew. My access credentials had expired on schedule, exactly as they were built to. The way any responsible clinical system automatically locks down when its administrator is no longer with the organization. It wasn't malice. It wasn't a trap. It was simply what happens when nobody replaces the person holding up the ceiling, and the ceiling had been counting on me to keep holding it, every single day, for 15 years, without anyone in that building ever asking what would happen if I stopped. Without the acuity matrix, the charge nurses on every floor were back to doing staffing ratios by hand, on paper, the way it was done in the 90s, except none of them had ever been trained to do it that way, because the system had done it for them since before most of them were hired. The float pool didn't know where to send anybody. The ER, Yvette said, had been operating Wednesday night, at what she guessed was less than 60% of appropriate staffing, and nobody upstairs had caught it until a patient in room 14 coded, and it took 11 minutes to find a nurse who wasn't already drowning in 4 other patients. 11 minutes. I had built that system, in part, to make sure a number like that never existed at Magnolia Regional again. They are saying it's a computer glitch, Yvette said. Sterling had IT in his office half the night. Nobody that can even open the back end of it. They don't know the password, they don't know the architecture, they don't know anything. Bev. It's like you took the blueprints to your own house when you left. I did not say what I was thinking, which was, I did not take the blueprints. I simply stopped being willing to redraw them for free, for a man who called 15 years of my life old energy. I'm sorry you're dealing with that, I told her, and I meant it, because Yvette was not the one who fired me, and neither were the nurses on the floor, and neither were the patients in those beds. I hope they figure it out soon. Bev? Her voice dropped even lower. They are saying your name in there like it's a curse word and a prayer at the same time. I did not go back. I want that understood clearly, because there will be people listening to this who expect the moment where the phone rings, and I rush back through those doors to save the day, keep billowing, because that is how these stories usually go. That is not the story I am telling you. I hung up the phone, and I went out to my garden, and I pulled weeds for 45 minutes in the cool of the morning, and I thought about my husband, gone 7 years now, and what he used to say to me when I'd come home exhausted from carrying that hospital on my back for free, emotionally if not literally. He used to say, Beverly, you cannot pour from a cup they keep refusing to fill. I hadn't listened to him properly while he was alive. I was starting to now. The calls from unknown numbers kept coming. I let them all go to voicemail, and by Thursday evening I had 11 messages I hadn't listened to. I finally sat down with a cup of chamomile tea and played them back, one at a time, the way you might examine something dangerous from a safe distance. The first 3 were Sterling. His voice climbed with each one, professional, and clipped in the first, brittle by the second, openly pleading by the third. Beverly, we need to talk about the system's architecture. This isn't personal. I need you to understand that. Call me back. Then, an hour later, Beverly, patients are being affected. I need the administrator credentials for the Acuity platform. This is a patient safety issue now. Then, close to midnight, Beverly, please. I don't know who else built this, nobody in IT can even find documentation, please call me. I noticed he had stopped calling me old energy, and started calling me the only person who understood the house he was living in. The fourth voicemail surprised me. It was from Trina Okafor, a name I recognized immediately, a young charge nurse I had mentored for 2 years before she got promoted to the overnight ICU rotation. Trina's voice was different from Sterling's, not pleading, just tired, and honest in a way that Sterling never had been with me. Ms. Whitfield, I know you probably don't want to hear from anybody at this hospital right now, and I understand if you don't call back. I just wanted you to know what they did to you was wrong, and everybody on the floor knows it. And I'm sorry nobody said anything when it happened. I hope you're doing okay. I sat with that voicemail longer than any of the others. I played it twice. Trina had nothing to gain by leaving that message, no system to fix, no favor to ask. She simply wanted me to know that somebody had seen what happened and called it by its name. That message did more for me than anything Sterling Vance said in the other 10. The remaining messages were mostly Sterling again, and then, on Friday morning, one from a number I didn't recognize at all. A voice I did not know, smooth, careful, the voice of a man used to smoothing things over for a living. Ms. Whitfield, my name is Marcus Delane. I'm outside counsel retained by the Magnolia Regional Board of Directors. I'd like to speak with you at your earliest convenience regarding a resolution that would be mutually beneficial to all parties. Please give my office a call. Mutually beneficial. I had heard that phrase before, from men who had already decided what beneficial meant, and was simply waiting for me to agree to it. I did not call Marcus Delane back that day. I let the request sit, the way you let bread rise, not because I was punishing anyone, but because rushing does nothing for dough, and it does nothing for negotiations either. I have learned, over the course of my life, that the person who speaks first from a place of panic is always the one who ends up giving the most away. That Friday afternoon, my doorbell rang. I looked through the front window before I opened it, and standing on my porch, in a suit that fit him a little too tightly across the shoulders, was a man I recognized instantly. Reggie Calloway, one of Sterling's younger administrative hires. A man barely 30, who had been brought in 8 months earlier to handle board relations, whatever that meant. I had trained him, briefly, on how to read a staffing report before he transferred out of clinical operations entirely. I opened the door, but did not invite him in. Ms. Whitfield. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. Mr. Vance asked me to come by personally. He wanted me to express how much the hospital values your contributions, and to see if there's anything we could. Reggie, I said, gently, because none of what was happening was his fault. You drove 40 minutes to my house on a Friday to tell me the man who fired me values my contributions. He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. Tell Sterling, I said, that if he wants to talk to me, he can have his lawyer call my lawyer. I'm not interested in doorstep conversations. I closed the door, gently, and I watched through the window as Reggie stood on my porch for a long moment before walking back to his car, the phone already at his ear. That evening, I finally called Camille Duros back and told her everything: the severance papers, the ownership of the systems, the 11 voicemails, the outside counsel, the young man on my porch. Camille listened the way good lawyers listen, quiet and patient, taking notes I couldn't see. And when I finished, she said something I have carried with me every day since. Beverly, you built something they can't live without, and you built it before they ever thought to ask who owned it. That is not a small thing. That is the only leverage most people in your position ever get in their whole lives. And you have it. Don't waste it being generous too early. I slept that night without a single voicemail waiting for me in the morning, because I had finally turned my phone all the way off. But I would learn, 2 days later, that Sterling Vance was not a man who understood the meaning of no answer. He was a man who, when denied, simply looked for another door to knock on, and this time, it would not be my front porch. The other door Sterling Vance found was my daughter. I want to tell you about Renata before I tell you what happened, because you need to understand who she is to understand how much it cost me to watch this unfold. Renata is 31, a labor and delivery nurse 2 states away, married to a good man named Dominic, expecting their first child in the spring. she is fierce and soft in the same breath, the way I raised her to be, and she has never once in her life needed me to fight her battles for her. Which is precisely why what happened next made my blood go cold in a way that 15 voicemails from Sterling Vance never could. She called me Sunday evening, and I could hear it in her voice before she said a single word that particular register mothers learn to recognize in their daughters' voices no matter how many miles sit between them. "Mama, somebody from the hospital called me today." I set down the dish towel I was holding. "Called you where, baby?" "At work. They called the unit desk at my hospital and asked to speak to Renata Whitfield Cross. Said they were following up on a family matter regarding my mother's separation agreement." Her voice tightened. "They asked me if I knew anything about Mama. They asked if I knew the password to something. A system. They said it was urgent, patient safety, and that maybe I could help them reach you since you weren't returning calls." I felt something shift in my chest, something quiet and dangerous settle into place. Not rage, I want to be clear about that, because rage is loud, and what I felt was not loud at all. It was cold, and it was clear. And it was the precise moment I understood that Sterling Vance was no longer simply desperate. He was willing to use my child to get to me. "What did you tell them?" I asked, keeping my voice even, the way I have always kept my voice even when the ground under me wanted to shake. "I told them I didn't know anything about my mother's employment, and that if they contacted me at my job again, about a personal matter, I'd be filing a complaint with their compliance office and mine." A short, proud breath. "Then I called you." "You did exactly right," I told her, and I meant it, and something in me, some old ache I didn't know I was still carrying, eased slightly, knowing that whatever else Sterling Vance had done, he had not managed to make my daughter afraid. He had only managed to make her angry on my behalf, which is a very different thing, and a far more dangerous one for him. I called Camille first thing Monday morning. I did not raise my voice on that call either, though I will tell you, plainly, that it took everything in me not to. "They contacted my daughter at her place of employment," I told her. "About me?" There was a pause on the line, the particular pause of a lawyer recalculating a strategy in real time. "Beverly," Camille said slowly, "that's not just poor judgment on their part, depending on how it was phrased, that could be harassment, and it's absolutely something we document. I want the exact date, the exact time, and I want your daughter to write down, today, while it's fresh, exactly what was said to her, word for word, and who called." We did that. Renata typed it up that same afternoon and emailed it to Camille directly, and reading her account, precise, calm, exactly like her mother, I'll admit that with some pride I felt for the first time since that Tuesday morning in Sterling's office that the story was no longer only happening to me. It was becoming something we could hold in our hands and turn over and use. Camille called me back 2 days later with an update that shifted the entire shape of things. "I did some digging," she said. "You mentioned in passing that Sterling has been talking about a proprietary staffing algorithm in some hospital association circles, bragging about it, actually, at a healthcare innovation panel back in the spring, months before he fired you. I pulled the recording, Beverly. He described your acuity system, in detail, as something his administration developed in-house under his leadership. He didn't mention your name once." I sat very still, holding the phone, feeling something I had not expected to feel. Not surprise, exactly, because some quiet corner of my mind had already suspected this. But confirmation is its own kind of blow, even when you saw it coming. "There's more," Camille continued. "I found a filing a provisional application with the state's Health Innovation Grant Program, submitted under Sterling Vance's name individually, not the hospital's, describing a novel clinical staffing optimization framework. The description matches your surge staffing model almost line for line, Beverly. If that application goes through, he stands to receive a Personal Innovation Award and a grant renewal tied to his name as the inventor of something you built at your kitchen table while he was still working at his previous hospital in another state." I want to tell you I felt shocked. I did not. I felt, instead, a kind of grim clarity, the way you feel when a doctor finally names the thing that's been making you sick. And even though the diagnosis is bad, there's a strange relief in finally understanding the shape of what you're fighting. "Do you have the recordings?" The filing? I asked. I have copies of both, and I want you to think very carefully about what you actually want here, because we now have two separate threads. Point 1 is a labor and severance matter. A woman with 15 years of service pushed out under language that could support an age discrimination claim, especially paired with what happened with your daughter. The other is intellectual property theft, potentially serious enough to affect a state grant application and his professional licensing standing, together. Beverly, this is not a case where you go in asking for anything small. I thought about Sterling's glass desk. I thought about the framed commendation I'd left hanging on my old office wall. I thought about 11 minutes it took to find a nurse for the man in room 14. And the 60% staffing Yvette had described. And Trina's voicemail, tired and honest, the only voice in 11 messages that hadn't wanted something from me. I don't want revenge, I told Camille, and I meant it fully, the way I have meant very few things in my life. I want it done right. I want it documented, and I want it undeniable, and when it's finished, I want to never have to think about Sterling Vance again. Then here's what we do, Camille said, and I could hear, for the first time, something like anticipation in her voice. We let his lawyer set the meeting. We let them believe they are coming to negotiate with a grieving, desperate former employee, and we walk in with everything. That Wednesday, Marcus Delane's office called Camille's office directly, requesting a sit-down the following Monday. Myself, Camille, Sterling, and, at his insistence, the hospital's board chair. A woman named Diane Okonkwo-Reyes, who Camille said had a reputation as somebody who did not tolerate being blindsided twice. I spent that weekend doing something I had not done in years. I went through my old hard drive, folder by folder, and I found every timestamped file, every version history, every late-night email exchange, where I'd asked the old IT director for server access to test something I was building on my own time, every internal memo where I'd flagged a staffing gap the Acuity system later solved. 15 years leaves a paper trail, if you know where to look, and I had built every piece of that trail. Myself, quietly, the way I have done everything in my life without ever imagining I might one day need to lay it all out on a table in front of the people who tried to erase it. Camille organized it into a binder 3 inches thick. On the Sunday night, before the meeting, she called me one last time. Beverly, I need you to understand something before tomorrow. Once we walk into that room, there is no version of this where Sterling Vance keeps pretending he built what you built. Are you ready for what that means for you, going forward? I looked out my kitchen window at the garden I'd been tending all month, the one thing that was entirely, quietly mine. I have been ready, I told her, since the morning he called. 15 years of my life, old energy. The boardroom at Magnolia Regional smelled like burnt coffee, and something else underneath it. Something I recognized from 30 years of hospital administration, the particular scent of an institution in crisis. All hand sanitizer, and stress sweat, and cold catering nobody had touched. I arrived with Camille at exactly 9 o'clock, not a minute early, because Camille had taught me over the weekend that arriving early to a negotiation like this one signals eagerness. And eagerness is the first thing you give away for free. I wore the navy suit I'd bought for my late husband's memorial service 7 years earlier, the one that still fit exactly the way it had then, and I wore my mother's silver ring on my right hand, the one she wore for 40 years running a school cafeteria. And never once let anybody make her feel small. Sterling was already seated when we walked in, along with Marcus Delane, whose smooth voicemail voice matched a smooth, carefully unreadable face, and a woman I hadn't met before, silver-streaked hair pulled back severely, reading glasses pushed up into it. A legal pad already covered in her own handwriting. Diane Okonkwo-Reyes did not smile when we entered. She did not frown either. She simply watched, the way I imagine she had watched a great many rooms in her time, waiting to see who would speak first and what that would tell her. Sterling spoke first. Of course he did. Beverly, thank you for coming. I know this has been a difficult transition, and I want to start by saying the hospital deeply regrets any. Mr. Vance, Camille said, gently but with a precision that stopped him mid-sentence. Before we go further, I think it would be useful for everyone in this room to be working from the same set of facts. Would you object if I shared some materials? Diane's eyes moved from Camille to Sterling, and something in her expression sharpened. Almost imperceptibly, she gestured with one hand. Please. Camille opened the binder. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She simply began laying documents on the table, one at a time, each one landing with the soft, terrible weight of a fact that cannot be argued with. The first was a time-stamped file history showing the original creation date of the surge staffing algorithm 3 years before Sterling Vance had ever set foot at Magnolia Regional, built on a personal license, developed on personal hardware, documented in commit logs with my name attached to every single revision. The second was the recording. Camille played 11 seconds of it, no more, Sterling's own voice at the Healthcare Innovation Panel that spring. What my administration has built here at Magnolia is a staffing optimization framework that I believe is genuinely without precedent in a facility our size. She let it hang in the air. She did not need to play more than that. Diane's jaw tightened. She looked at Sterling. He did not look back at her. The third document was the provisional grant application, Sterling Vance's name listed as sole inventor, the description of the novel clinical staffing optimization framework, laid beside a printed copy of my own internal documentation from 4 years earlier, the language close enough that Diane read both pages twice before setting them down without a word. The fourth was Renata's written account, the call to her employer, the request for password information, the implicit threat buried inside a request that had no business being made to a woman who did not even work at that hospital. I want to be very clear, Camille said, into the silence that had settled over the room like weather, that we are not here today to discuss whether Ms. Whitfield's separation was handled appropriately, though we have significant concerns there as well, given her age, her tenure, and the language used in her termination meeting. We are here because Mr. Vance has, by his own recorded words and his own signed grant filing, claimed personal inventorship and personal credit for intellectual property that Ms. Whitfield created, owns, and never transferred to this institution. That is a very different conversation. Sterling finally spoke, and his voice had lost the polish it carried in his office 3 weeks earlier. This is Beverly. You know that system evolved through years of institutional use. It's not as though Mr. Vance. Diane's voice cut across his, quiet but absolute, the voice of a woman who had clearly run out of patience sometime in the last 4 minutes, and had no intention of pretending otherwise. Is it true that the grant application lists you as sole inventor? A pause. The language may need refinement, but is it true, she said again, slower, that you personally filed for a state innovation award, using your own name, for a system built by a woman sitting at this table who you terminated 3 weeks ago? He did not answer. The silence answered for him. I had told Camille, the night before, that I did not want revenge. I want you to understand that as this moment unfolded, sitting in that room, watching a 35-year-old man, who had once called me old energy, go pale and small under the gaze of his own board chair, I did not feel triumphant. I felt, mostly, tired the way you feel at the end of a very long shift, when the crisis has finally passed and all that's left is the quiet accounting of what it cost everyone involved. I'd like to lay out what we are asking for, Camille said, and she looked to me, the way we'd practiced, giving me the room to speak the terms myself, because some things a woman needs to say in her own voice for them to mean anything at all. 3 things, I said, and my voice did not shake, though the room was very quiet and every eye at that table was on me. First, the grant application is withdrawn immediately, in writing, and any credit or award tied to that system is formally corrected to reflect that it was developed independently by me, prior to and outside the scope of my employment. Second, Magnolia Regional enters into a formal licensing agreement for continued use of the systems I built, the acuity matrix, the float algorithm, the surge protocol at fair market rate, going forward, month to month, cancelable by either party. Third, I return to this hospital in no capacity other than independent consultant, on my own schedule, at my own rate, reporting to no one. I will help you stabilize the units that are currently struggling. I will not be anyone's employee again. Diane looked at me for a long moment. Something had shifted in her face since we'd walked in, not warmth, exactly, but a kind of recognition, one careful, competent woman assessing another. And if we don't agree to those terms, she asked, not unkindly, simply for the record. Camille answered that one. Then Ms. Whitfield discontinues the courtesy she has extended so far, in not pursuing the age discrimination claim available to her. We forward this documentation to the State Grant Oversight Board and the licensing authority that oversees Mr. Vance's administrative credentials, and we make ourselves available to any journalist who might find it noteworthy that a hospital collapsed operationally within 72 hours of terminating the one employee who understood how it actually functioned. Sterling's face had gone the color of old paper. Diane, we can find a path that doesn't require. Sterling, Diane said, and she did not look at him when she said it. I'd like you to step out of the room for a few minutes. He left. I watched him go, watched the door close behind him, and I felt no satisfaction in it. Only a kind of grim, exhausted clarity, the sense of watching a house of cards finally fall down under its own weight. Exactly the way it was always going to. Diane turned back to Camille and me, and for the first time that morning, something almost like respect crossed her face. Ms. Whitfield, she said, I think we have a great deal to discuss. Diane Okonkwo Reyes did not waste time once Sterling left the room. I want to apologize to you directly, Ms. Whitfield, she said, closing the folder in front of her with a kind of finality. Not the corporate apology, the real one. I've sat on this board for 6 years. I approved Sterling Vance's hire 14 months ago because his resume was impressive and his references were glowing. And I did not do enough, in the months since, to understand what was actually holding this hospital together underneath him. That failure is on me as much as it is on him. I appreciated the honesty. I did not soften because of it, not yet. Because Camille had taught me that graciousness offered too early is just another way of giving something away for free. I appreciate you saying that, I said. I'd like to see it reflected in writing, alongside everything else we discussed. It will be. She made a note on her legal pad, then looked up. Can I ask you something, off the record, one professional to another? I nodded. How long has this hospital actually been running on systems you built alone, without proper institutional backing? I thought about that question honestly, the way I owed it to be answered. The acuity matrix, 6 years. The float algorithm, 4. The surge protocol I built during the worst of the pandemic surge, when there was no money for consultants and patients were dying because nobody could tell a charge nurse in real time whether she had enough hands on the floor. Nobody asked me to build any of it. I built it because I couldn't sleep otherwise. Diane was quiet for a long moment. That is either the most impressive thing I've heard in this job, or the most damning indictment of how this institution has been run for the last decade. I suspect it's both. Camille spoke up then, steering us back toward the practical. We'd like to move quickly on the licensing agreement, given that 3 units are currently operating without functional staffing support. Ms. Whitfield is prepared to restore limited system access within 24 hours of a signed agreement, strictly under the terms we outlined. Understood. Diane made another note, then hesitated, glancing toward the closed door Sterling had disappeared through. I'll be honest with you, both the grant application issue is worse than even what you've shown me today. I received a call last week, before this meeting was scheduled, from someone on our finance committee. There have been questions raised about certain vendor contracts Sterling pushed through in his first year. Consulting fees that don't appear to have produced any actual consulting. I didn't want to believe it was connected to anything larger. I'm starting to think I was wrong about that too. I did not ask for details, that was not my fight, and I had learned enough that week about the cost of fights that weren't mine to carry. But I noted, quietly, the way you note anything useful, that whatever was happening with Sterling Vance's finances was clearly bigger than a stolen staffing algorithm and a badly worded severance meeting. We spent the next 2 hours in that boardroom, the 3 of us, drafting language, adjusting terms, Camille pushing back gently but firmly whenever Diane's staff tried to soften a clause I'd asked for. By early afternoon, we had something close to a final agreement. The grant application would be formally withdrawn within 5 business days, with a corrected filing crediting me as sole developer of the systems in question. A licensing agreement would be executed for continued institutional use of the acuity, float, and surge protocols. at a rate Camille had researched thoroughly and which I will simply say was not small, and I would return, not as an employee, but as an independent consultant, on a contract that named my hours, my rate, and my right to walk away at any time with 30 days' notice. Diane signed first, then Camille, on my behalf as witness, then me, in the same steady handwriting I'd used to sign my own termination papers 3 weeks earlier, except this time, my hand did not feel like it was closing a door.It felt like it was opening one, on my own terms, for the first time in 15 years. There's one more thing, Diane said, as we were gathering our things. I'd like your recommendation on interim clinical operations leadership, while the board decides how to handle Mr. Vance's position going forward. I don't want to make the same mistake twice. I thought of Trina Okafor, immediately tired, honest Trina, the only voice among 11 voicemails who had asked for nothing and simply told me the truth. There's a charge nurse in your ICU, I said. Trina Okafor. She's young, but she has better instincts than most people twice her age, and she's the only person who called me after I left without wanting something from me first. Diane wrote the name down. I did not see Sterling again that day. Camille told me later that he'd been asked to wait in a separate conference room for nearly 3 hours before being informed, briefly and without much ceremony, that the board would be convening an emergency session within the week to review his continued employment. I felt, hearing that, exactly what I expected to feel, which was very little. He was no longer my problem to think about. I had spent 15 years making myself responsible for things that were never mine to fix for free, and I was done doing that, for him or for anyone. I drove home that evening with the windows down, the last warm light of the day coming in gold across the dashboard, and for the first time since that Tuesday morning at his glass desk, I let myself feel something close to lightness, not triumph, not yet, but something quieter, and steadier, and entirely my own. My phone buzzed once as I pulled into my driveway. A text from Trina, Ms. Whitfield, I don't know what you did today, but Diane Okonkwo-Reyes just called me into her office, and I think my life is about to change. Thank you, however this happened. I smiled, alone in my car, in the dark of my own driveway, and I typed back 4 words before going inside to the quiet of a house that belonged entirely to me. You've earned every bit. The emergency board session convened 9 days later. On a Thursday morning I did not attend, because by then it was no longer my business to witness. It belonged to the institution, and to whatever counting they owed themselves for the 14 months they'd spent trusting a man's Polish over a woman's proof. But Diane called me that evening, and though I hadn't asked for details, she offered them anyway, the way people do once they've decided you're someone worth being honest with. The Finance Committee's inquiry into Sterling's vendor contracts had grown teeth in the 2 weeks since our meeting. What had started as a single-flagged consulting invoice unraveled, thread by thread, into a pattern. 3 separate vendor agreements, all approved under Sterling's signature authority without competitive bid, all paid out to firms that shared a registered address with a business Sterling's brother-in-law had incorporated 8 months before Sterling's own hire at Magnolia Regional, nearly $200,000 in fees, over the course of a year, for consulting work the Finance Committee could find no evidence had ever been performed. I want to be careful here, Diane told me. I'm not going to sit on the phone with you and gossip about a man's downfall, but I think you deserve to know that what happened to you wasn't an isolated failure of judgment. It was a pattern. You were simply the piece that mattered most to patients, so you're the piece that broke the loudest. I appreciated that she said it plainly, without softening it into something smaller. I have found, over a long life, that people are often more comfortable telling you a wrong was an accident than telling you it was a pattern, because a pattern requires someone to have known and looked away. Diane did not look away. I respected her more for that than for anything else she'd said across that boardroom table. Sterling Vance was placed on administrative leave that Thursday, pending a full financial review, and the grant application withdrawal Camille and I had negotiated was filed the same week, formally, in writing, my name attached where his had been. I will admit I read that corrected filing more than once. There's a particular kind of peace in seeing your own name where someone else tried to erase it, not loud, not triumphant, just quiet and complete, the way a door finally clicks shut all the way. After years of hanging slightly open. I did not celebrate his administrative leave. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell you I felt joy, and it would not be true. What I felt, mostly, was the particular exhaustion of a woman who has spent 3 weeks proving, with documents and recordings and her own daughter's written testimony, that she deserved to be treated like a human being rather than a line item marked for reduction, exhaustion. And underneath it, something steadier, the sense that I had handled it the way I wanted to handle it, without becoming someone I didn't recognize in the mirror. Renata called that weekend, and for the first time since the incident with her employer, she sounded like herself again, light. A little teasing, the daughter I raised instead of the daughter who'd had to write a legal statement about a man harassing her at work. So he's really done, she asked. He's on leave. What happens after that isn't up to me anymore. Mama. A pause, and I could hear the smile in it. You do know you basically dismantled a hospital executive with a hard drive and a lawyer, right? Dad would have been so proud of you. He always said you were the smartest person in every room you walked into, and too humble to ever say it yourself. I felt my throat tighten, the way it still does sometimes when Renata brings her father into a conversation without warning. He also used to tell me I gave too much of myself away for free, I said. I think I finally listened. I returned to Magnolia Regional the following Monday, not as an employee, but exactly as the contract specified, an independent consultant, on my own hours, at my own rate, walking through doors I had once walked through as someone who could be discarded in a 15-minute meeting. The difference in how it felt was not small. I parked where I wanted to park. I answered to no supervisor. When Trina Okafor, now serving as interim director of clinical operations, met me in the lobby with an expression somewhere between relief and disbelief, she did something I did not expect. She hugged me, right there by the information desk, in front of everyone. I didn't know how to ask if you'd come back, she said. I didn't think I had the right to ask. You didn't have to ask, I told her. You were the only person who called me without wanting something. That's the only invitation I needed. Over the following month, I rebuilt what had broken, not because the hospital deserved my generosity, but because the patients on those floors had never done anything to me, and because Trina, and Yvette, and even young Reggie Calloway, who came to my temporary office on my 3rd day back and apologized, unprompted, for the doorstep visit weeks earlier, deserved a functioning system to work inside. I restored the acuity matrix within the first week. I retrained 3 new hires on the float algorithm myself, on my own schedule, breaking for lunch when I wanted to break, leaving at 4 some days simply because I felt like it. I want you to notice something about that sentence, because it is the entire shape of what changed in me during those weeks, leaving because I felt like it. 15 years. And I do not believe I had ever once left a shift early simply because I wanted to. I had always stayed, because someone needed me to, because the schedule needed covering, because I had built my entire identity around being the person who did not leave until the work was done. Nobody had ever told me I was allowed to decide for myself when enough was enough. Sterling Vance's administrative leave became a formal termination 6 weeks later, following a financial review that Diane described to me only in the broadest terms, though the local business paper eventually ran a short piece about leadership changes and a vendor contract review at Magnolia Regional, careful and vague in the way these things always are until they aren't anymore. I did not read the article twice. I did not need to. I had already gotten everything I came for, and none of it involved watching a man's public unraveling from the sidelines with a bowl of popcorn, the way the story might have gone if I were someone else, telling it a different way. But something was still unfinished, something I hadn't expected. A phone call, 3 months into my new arrangement, from a name I did not recognize, representing an organization I had never heard of, about an opportunity that would change the shape of the rest of my working life entirely. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in early autumn, 3 months into my consulting arrangement with Magnolia Regional, while I was sitting in my garden, with a cup of tea and a legal pad, sketching out an updated version of the float algorithm that I'd been wanting to build for years, but never had the freedom to attempt properly while I was someone's employee. Ms. Whitfield. My name is Adiz Brennan. I'm calling from the Coalition For regional health systems, we're a non-profit consortium representing 11 mid-size hospitals across 3 states. I hope you don't mind the cold call. I got your name from Diane Okonkwo Reyes, who I believe you know. I set down my tea. I know Diane. What can I do for you, Ms. Brennan? Please, call me Adiz. I'll be direct with you, because I understand you appreciate directness. Diane told our board, in some detail, about the systems you built independently at Magnolia Regional, and about how those systems performed compared to what every other facility in our coalition is currently using, which is, frankly, a patchwork of expensive vendor software that half our member hospitals can't afford to properly maintain. We've been searching for over a year for someone who could design a shared staffing and acuity framework that smaller hospitals could actually license affordably, something built by someone who understands clinical operations from the inside, not a software company that's never set foot on a hospital floor. I sat very still, the autumn light falling gold and low across my garden, and I felt something unfamiliar rising in my chest. Not caution, exactly, though I have learned to always keep a measure of that close at hand, something closer to recognition. The sense of a door opening that I had not gone looking for, but that fit, somehow, the exact shape of the years I'd spent building things nobody asked me to build. I'm listening, I said. Adiz explained the scope over the next 20 minutes. 11 hospitals, none of them large enough to build proprietary clinical software of their own, all of them drowning in the same problems Magnolia Regional had drowned in the moment I walked away. Bad staffing ratios, delayed acuity assessments, nurses making life or death triage decisions without the tools to see the whole floor clearly. The coalition wanted to license a shared system, built once, adapted for each facility's specific needs, maintained by a small team rather than one overworked administrator doing it alone at her kitchen table at midnight. We'd want you to lead the development, Adiz said. Not as an employee of any single hospital. As the founder and principal of your own consulting practice, contracted directly by the coalition, with full ownership of the intellectual property. The way it should have been structured for you the first time around, frankly. Would cover build costs, staffing for a small technical team to help you scale it, and a licensing structure that would pay you a percentage of every hospital's subscription, indefinitely, for as long as the systems remain in use. I want to tell you that I said yes immediately, because it would make for a cleaner story. I did not. I told Adiz I would need 2 weeks to think it over, and she agreed without pushing, which told me something important about the kind of organization I would be dealing with if I said yes. I spent those 2 weeks doing something I had rarely allowed myself to do in 52 years of living. I sat with a decision that was entirely, uncomplicatedly mine, with no husband to consult, though I thought of him often, no employer whose approval I needed, no daughter whose life I might disrupt, just me, my garden, and a legal pad full of numbers and questions. I called Camille first. She listened to the whole outline, and was quiet for a long moment before she spoke. Beverly, I want you to understand what you're being offered here. You're being offered the chance to finally be paid, properly, for the thing you've been doing for free for 15 years. Not just once, ongoing. This is the thing I told you about in the beginning, the leverage you built without knowing you were building it. This is what it was always for. I called Trina next, mostly because I wanted to hear a voice from Magnolia Regional that had nothing to do with boardrooms or lawyers. She was quiet when I told her. And then she said something that stayed with me longer than almost anything else said to me that whole autumn. Ms. Whitfield, can I tell you something? When I was coming up, watching you work, I used to think the whole hospital just ran on its own, like magic, like the schedule just made itself and the floors just balanced themselves. It took you getting fired for me to understand that magic was just you, quietly doing the work of 4 people, every single day, and nobody ever thought to say thank you out loud until it was almost too late. I'm glad somebody's finally going to pay you what that's actually worth. I gave Adiz Brennan my answer on the first Monday of the following month. I said yes, but on my own terms, the way I have insisted on doing everything since that Tuesday morning at Sterling Vance's glass desk, full ownership retained in my name, a board seat on the Coalition's Clinical Advisory Committee, and the right, written explicitly into the contract, to walk away with 60 days' notice if the work ever stopped feeling like mine. I named the practice Whitfield Clinical Systems. I chose the name deliberately, the way I have learned to choose everything deliberately now, not Magnolia, not Sterling, not any institution that might someday decide my worth expired on their timeline instead of my own, just my name, on my own door, for the first time in my working life. I did not know yet, sitting in my garden that October afternoon with the contract signed and the ink still fresh, how far Whitfield Clinical Systems would grow in the years that followed, or how many hospitals, some of them institutions far larger and far more storied than Magnolia Regional ever was, would eventually come knocking on a door I built entirely for myself. I only knew, in that quiet moment, that I had finally stopped waiting for someone else to recognize what I was worth, and started deciding it myself. Whitfield Clinical Systems began in the smallest possible way a company can begin, with me, a laptop, and a folding table I set up in what used to be Renata's childhood bedroom, the one I'd been meaning to turn into a proper home office for years and never had the time to, back when every spare hour belonged to Magnolia Regional, whether I'd agreed to give it away or not. Adiz Brennan connected me, in those first weeks, with a small technical team the coalition had budgeted for: 2 contract developers, a woman named Odalise Ferreira, who specialized in healthcare data compliance, and a younger man, barely 26, named Bryce Coleman, who I will admit I was skeptical of at first, only because I had spent 15 years watching young men with confident voices take credit for work that wasn't theirs. Bryce, to his considerable credit, spent our first meeting mostly listening, asking careful questions about the actual clinical logic behind the acuity matrix rather than assuming he already understood it better than the nurse who'd built it. I came to trust him within the month, the way I come to trust very few people quickly, through demonstrated humility rather than promised competence. The work itself was different from anything I had done before, and I want to describe that difference carefully, because it is the truest measure of everything that changed in me that year. At Magnolia Regional, I had built systems in stolen hours, guilty hours, time carved out of nights I should have spent sleeping or grieving my husband or simply existing without a task in front of me. At Whitfield Clinical Systems, I built the same kind of systems in daylight, at a pace I chose, with people who were paid properly to help me, and who treated my judgment as the reason the whole enterprise existed rather than an inconvenient afterthought to be managed around. The first hospital in the coalition to implement the new framework was a 200-bed facility in a small city 3 hours from my own, a place called Ridgemorne Community Medical Center, chronically understaffed, chronically underfunded, run by a chief nursing officer named Marguerite Boone, who reminded me, in the tired set of her shoulders during our first video call, of exactly what I had looked like 18 months before Sterling Vance ever sat me down at his glass desk. "I don't know if I even believe this will work," Marguerite told me honestly, during our onboarding call. "We've had 3 different vendor systems in 5 years. Every one of them promised the world and gave us a login screen and a support line nobody answers. This one is different," I told her, "because I built it from the floor up, not from a boardroom down. Give it 30 days. If it doesn't change how your charge nurses sleep at night, I'll refund the coalition myself." It changed how her charge nurses slept within the second week. Marguerite called me directly, unprompted, the way Trina once had, simply to tell me that for the first time in 3 years, her overnight ICU had gone a full week without a single night of dangerous understaffing, and that one of her senior nurses, a woman close to retirement, had cried in the break room the first time the system flagged a staffing gap 40 minutes before it would have become a crisis instead of catching it after the way every previous system always had. I did not cry when Marguerite told me that, but I sat at my folding table, in Renata's old bedroom, and I let myself feel, fully and without apology, the particular satisfaction of watching something I built with my own 2 hands, at my own kitchen table, finally reach the exact people it was always meant to protect. Word moved through hospital administration circles the way it always does, quietly, at conferences, in the careful gossip of chief nursing officers comparing notes over conference hotel coffee. By the 6-month mark, formal coalition hospitals had onboarded the system. By the 10-month mark, 3 facilities outside the original coalition entirely had reached out directly, having heard about Whitfield Clinical Systems from colleagues at Ridgemorne and 2 of the other early adopters. I hired Bryce full-time, that winter. I brought on a second developer in the spring. By the time a full year had passed since that Tuesday morning at Sterling Vance's glass desk, Whitfield Clinical Systems employed 6 people, served 14 hospitals across 4 states, and had moved out of Renata's childhood bedroom entirely into a small leased office suite 20 minutes from my house, one with my name, just my name, etched into frosted glass on the front door. I thought of Sterling only rarely by then. Diane had told me, some months earlier, that his termination had become permanent and public within the industry, that the vendor contract scandal had followed him into whatever quieter role he'd found afterward, and that his name no longer opened the doors it once had. I felt no particular joy in that. The way I want you to understand, I never sought his ruin as an end in itself. I had simply built something true, and something built on a foundation of quiet. Theft cannot stand forever beside something built on 15 years of unglamorous, unacknowledged, entirely real labor. One of those things was always going to outlast the other. I had simply made sure it was mine. Renata gave birth to a daughter that spring, my granddaughter, Josephine, 7 pounds 2 ounces, born on a Thursday morning while I sat in a waiting room 3 states away, because I had, for the first time in longer than I could remember, blocked out an entire week on my own calendar for no reason except that my family needed me, and I finally had a calendar that answered to nobody but myself. Holding Josephine for the first time, in a hospital room that was not Magnolia Regional, run by systems that were not mine, staffed by nurses I had never trained, I understood something I had not fully understood even in the boardroom the day Sterling Vance was asked to leave the room. I had not simply survived what happened to me. I had built, from the wreckage of it, something entirely new, and it belonged, finally and completely, to me. I want to tell you about the loneliness, because no story like this one is complete without it, and because I think it does a disservice to women like me to only show you the boardrooms and the binders and the quiet, satisfying moment a company signature finally bears your own name. The truth is more complicated than triumph, and I promised myself, sitting down to tell you all of this, that I would give you the truth. There is a particular kind of solitude that comes after you finally stop being needed by everyone but yourself. For 15 years, I had been the person the hospital called at 2 in the morning. I had been the person Renata called when her own daughter was born, the person a vet called from the parking garage, the person whose phone rang 11 times in a single week, because a system only I understood had gone dark, being needed, even when it exhausts you, even when it costs you everything. Gives a certain shape to your days. When Whitfield Clinical Systems began to run smoothly, when Bryce could troubleshoot without me, when Odalise handled compliance without needing my sign-off on every document, when Marguerite Boone's hospital hummed along on a system that no longer required my daily attention, I found myself, some evenings, sitting alone in my leased office suite with my name on the frosted glass, wondering what exactly I was building toward, now that I had already gotten everything I once thought I wanted. I did not tell anyone this for a long while, not Camille, not Renata, not even myself, really. In any words I let myself fully form, but I felt it, some autumn evenings, driving home past the turnoff that used to lead to Magnolia Regional, an old habit of the body that hadn't caught up yet with the new shape of my life. It was Trina, of all people, who noticed first. She called me on a Sunday, nearly a year and a half after everything began, just to check in, the way she'd taken to doing every few weeks since Magnolia Regional had promoted her permanently into the director role Diane had given her that first Thursday. "You sound tired in a different way than you used to," Trina said. "Not hospital tired, something else." I sat with that observation longer than I expected to. I think, I told her slowly, I built an entire life around making sure nobody could ever discard me again, and now that nobody can, I'm not entirely sure who I am when I'm not fighting for something. Trina was quiet for a moment. "Ms. Whitfield, can I say something? And you don't have to take it, you can just let it sit there if you want." "Go ahead. I think you're allowed to just be happy now, not build something to prove a point, not protect yourself from the next Sterling Vance. Just happy. Because you earned that, plain and simple. And I don't think anybody's ever told you that you're allowed to stop earning things and just receive them instead." I did not answer her right away, but I thought about it for days afterward, turning it over the way I turn over any problem worth solving properly. I started small. I took a Wednesday off, for no reason at all, and drove 2 hours to the coast, alone, and sat on a bench facing water. I didn't need to be anywhere else to see. I called an old friend from nursing school I hadn't spoken to in 6 years. A woman named Odessa, who had moved to Charlotte after her own divorce. And we talked for 2 hours about nothing important at all: grown children, gardens, a television show we'd both started watching independently, and had opinions about. I began attending church again on Sunday mornings, not out of the exhausted habit I'd fallen into during my Magnolia Regional years, arriving late and leaving early because there was always some crisis waiting, but fully, sitting in the same pew every week, staying afterward for coffee in the fellowship hall, letting myself be known by people who had nothing to gain from knowing me. I began dating again, cautiously, nearly 2 years after my husband's passing had finally settled into something softer than grief. A retired contractor named Walter Sumner, a widower himself, quiet and unhurried in a way that suited exactly where I was in my life. Walter did not ask me to explain Whitfield clinical systems in detail on our first dinner together. He asked me what I liked to grow in my garden, and whether I preferred tomatoes or peppers, and I found myself laughing, easily, for the first time in longer than I could remember, at a joke about squash that wasn't particularly funny except that I was finally, fully present enough to enjoy it. Renata noticed the change before I fully admitted it to myself. She visited that spring with Josephine, now walking unsteadily across my kitchen floor, reaching for anything within grabbing distance. And she watched me for a long moment across the table while Josephine gummed on a teething ring. "Mama," she said, "you look different, lighter." "I've been trying something new," I told her, letting myself rest without earning it first. "Good," Renata said simply, and reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "Dad would want that for you. I want that for you. You spent so long being everybody's foundation. I just want you to be able to sit on top of something solid for once, instead of always being underneath it, holding it up." That evening, after Renata and Josephine had gone to bed in the guest room, I sat alone in my garden in the last of the light, the way I had on so many evenings before. But this time the quiet did not feel like the exhausted aftermath of a battle. It felt like something I had built on purpose, brick by brick, the same careful way I had built everything else in my life that mattered: not loud, not showy, but entirely, solidly mine. I did not know, that evening in the garden, that the quiet I had built would be tested one more time before it was finally, permanently mine. Peace, I have learned, is not a door you walk through once. It is a room you have to keep choosing to stay in, even when someone leaves the gate open behind you. It happened the following spring, almost exactly 2 years after the morning Sterling Vance folded his hands on a glass desk and told me the board wanted new energy. Whitfield Clinical Systems had grown, by then, into something I barely recognized. Some mornings, when I opened my laptop at the kitchen table, 11 hospitals had become 23, spread across 5 states, and I had a technical team of 14 people who called me Ms. Whitfield in meetings, and Beverly in the hallway, the way people do when respect has settled into something easy instead of something performed. Adese Brennan called me on a Thursday morning, and I could tell from the particular careful evenness of her voice, the same evenness I use myself when I am about to say something someone doesn't want to hear, that this was not a routine call. "Beverly, I want you to hear this from me before you hear it anywhere else. Sterling Vance is on the shortlist for CEO at Fairhaven Memorial. It's one of our member hospitals. The board vote is in 3 weeks." I sat with that for a long moment, turning my coffee cup slowly on the table the way I do when I am deciding how much of what I feel is worth showing. "Fairhaven is licensed on our platform," I said. It was not a question. "Fairhaven has been on the Whitfield system for 14 months, Adese confirmed. If Sterling Vance becomes CEO there, he becomes, functionally, a client of yours. He would sit across the table from you at the annual coalition review. He would have access to usage data, contract terms, renewal pricing, everything." I thought about Sterling's glass desk, replacing the scratched oak one that had survived 3 CEOs and a flood. I thought about the phrase he'd used at that leadership retreat, about institutional agility, about how he didn't like old things. I understood, sitting in my kitchen 2 years and 1 entire life later, that some men do not learn, they simply relocate the same mistake to a new address and wait for someone else to clean it up. Does he know, I asked, that Whitfield Clinical Systems is my company? Adiz was quiet just long enough for me to have my answer before she gave it. I don't believe he's made the connection. The company name doesn't carry your full name on the public materials. It's branded WCS Health Solutions for the licensing side. He may genuinely not know. I want to tell you I felt triumphant in that moment, the way this kind of story is supposed to make a woman feel. I did not. I felt something quieter and strange, a kind of tired amusement, the specific fatigue that comes from watching a man walk, unknowingly, directly back into the reach of the very woman he once dismissed as replaceable. I had spent 2 years building something that did not need his approval, his memory, or his apology to be worth anything, and now here he was, about to sit down at a table I owned, without even the dignity of knowing it. I'm not going to sabotage his candidacy, I told Adiz, and I meant it. That's not who I am, and it never has been. If Verhaven's board wants him, that's between them and their own judgment. But I want you to know something, so there's no confusion later. I will not be softening any term of that contract for him, not the renewal pricing, not the support tier, not one clause. He gets exactly what every other CEO in this coalition gets, nothing more, and nothing less. That's exactly what I expected you to say, Adiz said, and I could hear, underneath the professionalism, something that sounded almost like pride. Sterling Vance got the job. I found out the way I find out most things now, not from a phone call meant to wound me, but from a routine coalition newsletter. His photograph small and forgettable in the corner of a page announcing new leadership appointments across member facilities. I looked at that photograph for exactly as long as it takes to drink one sip of coffee. And then I closed the laptop and went out to check on my tomatoes, because Walter had been right, months earlier, when he told me tomatoes needed more attention than peppers if I wanted them to actually come in sweet instead of just red. The annual coalition review was held in September, in a hotel conference center 2 hours from my house, the kind of sprawling glass building with a lobby waterfall that always strikes me as somebody's idea of impressing people who have long since stopped being impressed by lobbies. I had attended these reviews for 2 years by then. I no longer felt the particular tightness in my chest that used to come before walking into rooms full of hospital executives, men, mostly, who had spent their careers assuming competence, arrived in a certain kind of body, wearing a certain kind of confidence, and who had to be quietly, repeatedly corrected by the results on the page in front of them. I saw Sterling before he saw me. He was standing near the registration table, in a suit that fit him the way expensive suits fit men, who have not yet learned that money cannot fully substitute for humility, laughing at something with a man I didn't recognize, his badge reading Verhaven Memorial CO in the same clean sans serif font as everyone else's. I let Trina Okafor, who had come with me that year as part of the expanding advisory team, walk half a step ahead of me toward the registration table, and I watched Sterling's eyes catch my badge before they caught my face. Whitfield Clinical Systems founder and principal. I have replayed that half-second more times than I'll admit to you, the way his expression moved through recognition, then confusion, then a kind of scrambling arithmetic I could see happening behind his eyes. The specific math of a man trying to figure out how a woman he fired for having outdated energy had become the architect of the system his entire hospital now depended on to function. Beverly, he said, and his voice had lost every bit of the practiced smoothness I remembered from that glass desk. I didn't realize, Whitfield. I should have. Sterling, I said, and I did not raise my voice, because I have never needed to raise my voice to be heard clearly. Congratulations on Verhaven. I understand the acuity matrix implementation there has been going well. Your charge nurses gave it very strong marks in the last satisfaction survey. I watched him understand, in real time, that I had access to data about his own hospital that he likely hadn't personally reviewed yet, that the woman across from him held information, leverage, and infrastructure that his entire administration now quietly, structurally depended on. I watched him try to find his footing, the way men like Sterling always try, reaching for the language of collegiality, of bygones, of water under the bridge, and I let him reach for a moment before I spoke again. I want to be clear about something, so we don't have to revisit it, I said, still perfectly even, still perfectly pleasant, the way my mother taught me a woman could be devastating and gracious in the very same breath. I don't hold grudges. I don't need an apology, and I'm not interested in one, because an apology now wouldn't undo 15 years of being told I was the problem when I was, in fact, the only reason the whole operation ran. What I need from you, as a client of my company, is the same thing I need from every hospital in this coalition: timely renewal payments, honest usage reporting, and respect for my technical team's time. That's all. That's the entire relationship now. Understood, he said, and for the first time since I'd known him, Sterling Vance did not try to have the last word. I did not gloat. I want that understood clearly, because I know this is the part of the story where you might expect me to have savored it longer, to have circled back for one more cutting remark, one more reminder of exactly how far he had fallen and how high I had climbed. I did not, because I did not need to. The satisfaction I felt walking away from that registration table had nothing to do with his humiliation, and everything to do with the plain fact that I no longer required his good opinion, his validation, or his memory of who I used to be in order to know exactly who I was. Renata called me that night, the way she did most Sunday evenings, Josephine's voice babbling somewhere in the background over a video that never quite worked properly. I told her about the coalition review, the registration table, Sterling's face when he read my badge. She was quiet for a moment, and then she laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, the kind I hadn't heard from her in years before. That Tuesday morning changed everything. "Mama," she said, "you didn't even need to say anything ugly to him, did you? You just stood there being exactly who you are, and it wrecked him worse than anything you could have said." "That's usually how it works," I told her. "The people who spent years underestimating you don't need to be destroyed, they just need to watch you keep going without them." I want to tell you what happened to Sterling Vance after that, because I know there is a part of you listening tonight that wants a tidier ending for him, the kind where the story confirms, once and for all, that men like him get what they deserve in some dramatic, satisfying collapse. I don't have that story for you, and I've decided I'm at peace with that. The truth is quieter, and I think more honest. Sterling Vance kept his job at Fairhaven Memorial. As far as I know, he is still there. Whether he ever learned anything from that registration table encounter, whether he ever became a better administrator, a better man, a person capable of seeing the women who build the floor beneath his feet, I genuinely do not know. And somewhere in the last 2 years, I stopped needing to know. His growth, or his failure to grow, was never actually my responsibility. It never had been. I had just spent 15 years believing it was. There was one more test I hadn't anticipated, and it came not from Sterling Vance, but from inside the coalition itself, 6 months after that registration table encounter, in the form of a man named Preston Idowu, who chaired the coalition's finance committee and had, until that winter, been someone I considered a reasonably fair colleague, cordial in meetings, quick to compliment the platform's uptime numbers, the kind of board member who nodded along in agreement without ever quite making eye contact with the person doing the actual work. He called it a restructuring conversation when he requested the meeting, which should have told me everything I needed to know before I ever sat down across from him. Restructuring is the word men use when they've already decided what they want to take from you and are simply looking for the gentlest possible language to describe the theft. "Beverly," he said, in a conference room at the coalition's regional office. Adee seated beside me, though she had made it clear beforehand this was not a meeting she'd called or endorsed. "The Finance Committee has been discussing the long-term sustainability of the coalition's dependence on a single founder entity for something this critical to our member hospitals' operations. If something were to happen to you, an illness, a retirement, simply a change of heart, 31 hospitals would be left exposed. We think it's time to discuss bringing the core intellectual property under coalition ownership. A buyout, properly compensated, of course, but with the platform itself becoming coalition property going forward, maintained by an internal team rather than an outside contractor. An outside contractor. 2 years of 18-hour days building something from nothing, and I had become, in his careful language, an outside contractor whose work had simply become too important to be allowed to remain hers. I did not raise my voice. I have told you already that I have never needed to, but I felt something settle in my chest, cold and clear, the particular stillness that comes right before I say something a room will remember for a long time. Preston, I said, let's be precise about what you're actually proposing, because I want to make sure the minutes reflect it accurately. You're proposing that the coalition acquire, at a price the finance committee determines rather than the market determines, intellectual property that I designed, built, and have personally maintained and improved for 2.5 years, on the grounds that it has become too valuable for me to be trusted to keep owning it.Is that a fair summary? He shifted in his chair, the way men do when a woman refuses to let vague language do the work of softening an ugly proposal. It's not about trust, Beverly. It's about institutional risk management. It is entirely about trust, I said. It is about whether this committee trusts a 53-year-old black woman to remain the sole owner of something this valuable, or whether it becomes more comfortable to everyone once that ownership sits inside a structure, with a board full of people who look more like you. I've built systems for institutions my entire working life, Preston. I recognize this particular kind of restructuring conversation when I hear it, because I have sat on the other side of that exact sentence before, at a glass desk, from a different man, in a different building, being told that my 15 years of value had quietly become somebody else's to reallocate. The room went very quiet. Adiz did not look at me, but I saw her hand, resting on the table, curl slightly into something that was almost a fist of solidarity. I want to be extremely clear, for the record, I continued, so there is no ambiguity later. Whitfield Clinical Systems is not for sale, to the coalition, or to anyone else, at any price the finance committee determines unilaterally. If the coalition's member hospitals no longer wish to license the platform, that is their right, spelled out clearly in every contract I have ever signed, and they are free to seek a replacement vendor whenever they choose, but the platform itself, the code, the intellectual property, the 15 years of clinical knowledge encoded into every line of it that remains mine. It was mine when nobody wanted it. It is mine now that everybody suddenly does. I stood, gathered the folder in front of me, and looked at Preston Idowu the way my mother taught me to look at a man who has just revealed exactly who he is. I'll have my attorney review any formal proposal the committee wants to put in writing. Until then, I consider this restructuring conversation closed. Camille handled the legal correspondence that followed, and it turned out, unsurprisingly, that my original contract with the coalition, the one I had insisted on negotiating myself, full ownership retained in my name, the right to walk away with 60 days' notice, left absolutely no legal foothold for the kind of forced buyout Preston Idowu had imagined into being over some closed-door finance committee lunch. The proposal quietly died within a month. Adiz told me later that 2 other board members had privately pushed back on Preston before Camille's letter ever arrived, uncomfortable, finally, with what the whole conversation had actually revealed about themselves. I did not gloat about that one either, though I will admit, because I promised you honesty tonight, not just grace, that I allowed myself exactly one long, satisfied breath in my car in the parking garage after that meeting, the specific relief of a woman who built her own fortress carefully enough, years before she ever needed it, that no one could simply walk in and redraw the walls once they decided they liked the view. Walter and I married the following spring, in my own backyard, under the pergola he had built himself over one long, patient autumn, the same autumn I signed the Fairhaven renewal contract without a single discounted clause. It was a small wedding. Renata, as my witness, Josephine in a small white dress throwing rose petals with more enthusiasm than accuracy, Camille reading a short passage she'd chosen herself, Trina and Diane and Adiz seated together, at a table clearly enjoying the fact that 3 women who had each, in their own way, helped rebuild my life were finally in the same room together. I wore my mother's ring on a chain around my neck that day, not on my hand. Walter understood, without my having to explain it fully, that some things you carry close without needing to wear them the same way twice. He had his own losses. His own first marriage that had ended not in death, but in the slow erosion neglect causes over decades, and neither of us walked into that pergola pretending we were starting from nothing. We were 2 people who had already survived the hardest parts of building a life, choosing, deliberately and with open eyes, to build one more thing together, smaller and gentler than anything either of us had built before. Josephine turned 3 that autumn. She calls Walter Papa Walt, which he pretends to find mildly undignified and secretly treasures more than almost anything else in his life, judging by the way his face changes every single time she says it. Renata finished her nursing degree that winter, top of her cohort, and took a position not at Magnolia Regional. She was clear about that from the beginning. She wanted her own name built somewhere that had never known mine, at a community hospital 40 minutes from where I live now, close enough for Sunday dinners, far enough for her own life to stay unmistakably hers. Whitfield Clinical Systems now serves 31 hospitals across 7 states. I no longer build every line of the algorithm myself at midnight, though I still review every major update personally, because there are some things about the work I will never fully hand off, not out of distrust of my team, but because building things well has become, somewhere along the way, less an obligation and more a genuine pleasure, the last honest joy of a woman who spent 15 years believing her competence was owed to other people for free, and who finally, at 54 years old, gets to enjoy the simple fact of being good at something, on her own terms, for her own reasons. I still sit in my garden most evenings, the way I did that spring night after Renata told me I looked lighter. The quiet does not feel like the aftermath of a battle anymore. It has not for a long time now. It feels, most nights, like exactly what it is, a life I built on purpose, brick by careful brick, that belongs entirely, solidly, unmistakably to me. Sometimes Walter joins me out there with his own cup of coffee, and we don't talk much, and that not talking is its own kind of gift, the kind that only exists between two people who have both already done enough performing for other people's comfort, and have finally earned the right to simply be quiet together. If there is one thing I would want you to carry with you from everything I've told you tonight, it is this: the people who sat you at the servants' table, who folded their hands across a glass desk and called you worth yesterday's energy, who assumed you would keep showing up no matter how small a place they gave you at their table, they were never actually deciding your value. They were only ever revealing their own limitations. Your worth was never theirs to assign in the first place. It was always yours to discover, quietly, in your own time, on a night not unlike this one, sitting in a garden you built with your own 2 hands, finally, fully, entirely at peace. That's all for today's story. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. If you enjoyed it, please hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps the channel move closer to our 1 million subscriber milestone.